Many of the detectives that you see seem to be loners, and there's always the scene where they go back to the empty apartment, open the door, and there's an old pizza in there.
Sure.
Is your experience that a lot of the people were, in fact, loners and had kind of fallen into this from something else, or were they fairly routine family people?
The question is whether the archetype of the PI as a loner is accurate. I knew PIs who had perfectly healthy family lives, but a lot of PIs are former cops, and a lot of sometimes people say, well, it's a cliche, the hard drinking PI or the hard drinking cop. Well, I don't know. A high percentage of the cops and PIs I knew drank pretty hard, and they did it for obvious reasons. And I think that if you are susceptible to that, you may end up becoming a loner, not by choice, because nobody wants your company. You become difficult to live with. Ray, the character that I in my series, is not a loner by choice. He is alone, and he's trying to have a relationship with a woman. He's not very good at it, but he would rather not be a loner. He would rather open up to people. He's trying to learn how. But I think that there is basis in fact for that. Obviously, there are plenty of PIs and cops who have very healthy, normal family lives, though, as well.
Is there a reason that cops turn to doing PI work so much? Did they get sick of the pay, or
they get
kicked off the force?
Sometimes they get kicked off the force. Sometimes they put in their 20 and they've got a police pension, but they started when they were 20 years old. They've put in their 20 years. They've got their pension, and they're 40 or 45 or 50. Still need something to do, and because cops have to go when they're called. PIs can walk away. PIs can say, you know what, this is a bad idea. I'm not going to walk through that door. The cops have to walk through that door, and I think a lot of cops get to the point where they've done their bit. They've done their service to society, and now they want a job that's uses the skills they've got, and certainly the contacts they've got, and police will often refer work to PIs. And when they do, they refer work to PIs who used to be policemen, obviously. And so it's a natural progression.
And there was a question in the middle. Alicia, was there?
Do you want to just pass that down?
I had a question about the urban landscape in crime novels. How important is the urban area, and how do you select where your characters move through Chicago or New Orleans? They're big cities, so do you have some way of saying, I'm going to set a scene in this bar that is that places you've been to, or do they relate to the characters, or do the characters push that, or do you do something? Do you lay that out in advance?
The question is about the urban landscape in, for example, Chicago, and how you choose which areas, which neighborhoods, and so on to lay different scenes. In my case, part of it is dictated by the story, the plot that you're constructing, where people live. Chicago is they call it a city of neighborhoods, and it is, and every neighborhood is distinct. So a certain type of character would only be in certain types of neighborhoods. And but the other thing is that Chicago's neighborhoods are so changing in mood that I like to select neighborhoods that match the mood of the protagonist at that time. So if you chart Ray around the city, you're actually charting an emotional progression, which I don't expect that to be obvious on the page, but it's something I do to amuse myself.
When you hear people talking about setting as a character, it's more real than just a statement, because it really is about how the character interacts with not only the characters in that situation, but the environment itself. Whether he's a fish out of water or he's completely integrated is very important to the way a character acts. Yes,
and in fact, you'll respond emotionally to the same thing differently depending on what just happened to you that morning. The way you see a skyline or a landmark or a a downtrodden neighborhood or whatever, the way you see it and the way you respond to it emotionally will very much be affected by what you did in the last 24 hours.
In much the same way that the guy got served divorce papers.
Yes.
It affected his work.
Yeah, exactly. and it will affect the PI's work as well, the protagonist in these books.
Any questions? Right down here, Alicia. I don't know. You could probably shout it to us.
So how often in real life do you find yourself in dangerous situations?
Hopefully not often. If you're part of the job is to make sure that those things don't happen. So you try to absent yourself. Most of the job is not dangerous, right? Most of the job is doing research and finding out information, talking to people. Occasionally, serving subpoenas can be dangerous because sometimes you serve them court papers and they will react violently occasionally. I had a couple of instances, getting a witness statement from somebody who, you don't know going in. All you know is that person is a witness to a not even a crime, but to an accident that we were doing pre-trial investigation on. But what you don't know going in that person might have something else they're hiding, something else, some other reason to not want to talk to you. And so you knock on the door, they invite you, you ask to come in, you tell them why you're there, you're in there, and then all of a sudden they suspect that you're there for a reason other than the reason you're there, that you're trying to get something else out of them, and then they turn violent, and that can happen. That did happen. But it's very rare, I think.
I hope.
Yeah, I hope.
It was right here.
I guess you wrote your first book while you were still a PI. How long did you remain a PI while you were writing?
I didn't, actually. I quit being a PI, and it was actually quite a few years before I wrote the book. I quit being a PI in the mid-'90s, and I moved back to Toronto from New Orleans, and I worked in television. I did video editing and writing for documentaries and for a couple of children's shows. No guns in the children's shows. There were little talking hamsters and things. And corporate video stuff. I mean, just, whatever would pay the bills. So I was doing, and I would tell myself, I got to write that novel. All this thing has been leading to me writing that novel. But frankly, I was afraid of it. I was afraid to fail. It was something that I really loved. I was not afraid to fail at making television documentaries, so I made them and they were fine. But I was afraid of writing a bad book because it really meant a lot to me. I'd wanted to do it since I was a child, so I kept putting it off. And I kept abandoning. I wrote part of a manuscript and then threw it in the bottom of a drawer at page 80 and said, it's not working, I don't know what I'm doing. And then tried again a couple of years later and got to page 150 and threw that one in a drawer in disgust. And finally one day woke up and I was 35 years old and I said, write the damn thing to the end. Maybe it'll suck. Maybe nobody will buy it. But if you don't get to the end and type the end and say I did it, then one day you're going to say, why the hell didn't I actually write one of these things? This is what I want to do for a living. And so that time I stuck it out to the end. And in fact, that was Big City Bad Blood. That was my first novel and it sold.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I do.
What's your writing routine today?
My writing routine is, by nature, I'm a nocturnal writer, which really sucks because I have a wife and a child. And so for years I wrote, my wife would go to sleep and I would go into the next room and bang words all night. These days, we get up in the morning, I take my child to kindergarten, drop my wife at the office, go to my office. We have a tiny little house, and my son's room is what used to be my office in the house, and there's really not much room in the house. So I rent a little tiny office, which is walking distance from the house. And so I write during the day. I try to keep business hours and go back and pick them up at the end of the day. But I don't really keep business hours because often after my son is asleep, I will, as I said, my office is walking distance from the house. I'll walk back to work and work at night. I often find that if I'm having trouble, I'm a little bit stuck, having a little bit of trouble getting the words to flow, that usually the breakthrough, when it breaks through, will happen at night. And I know that that's not what I want my nature to be, but I tend to be nocturnal that way. So I often write at night still.